Thank you very much, Mireia. Sorry, I had to unmute my microphone. It's one of those automatisms that we still haven't fully developed as we interact more and more online. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. It is a real pleasure. It's not just politeness. I really enjoy interacting with people outside of the bubble, of the work bubble, in which we find ourselves in Brussels. And I personally very much like to interact with students as well. And I really do hope that after the hopefully brief overview that I will give you about the European Union digital policy, or policies more correctly, there will be plenty of time for Q&A, but most importantly, there will be your questions because we can have all the time of the world for the Q&A, but without your questions, we're just going to look at each other in the eyes, which I'd rather avoid. So without further ado, what I think I would like to do in the 10-15 minutes that I have is to give you a rather high-level overview of what are the main strategic goals, drivers, rationales of the way in which, in particular, the European Commission, which is the institution that I work for and I've been working for now for quite a few years. As I think I understand you're aware, the European Commission is the executive branch of the European Union. Therefore, I cannot speak on behalf of other institutions of the European Union, such as the European Parliament or the Council of the EU. I believe that Mireia might have distributed to you a few background resources that I had prepared, where you can go more in depth about different positions of the different institutions, which, truth be told, at the end of the day, they do not differ too much on what are, as I said, the main strategic orientation, the main strategic goals. And what are these main strategic orientations? Well, I think that the difficult situation in which we all find ourselves in Europe, but all across the world, and I'm referring, of course, to the pandemic. And by the way, let me say, I really hope that all of you and all of your families and loved ones are faring reasonably well or acceptably well in these difficult times. But what these times have also shown very, very clearly is that digitalization and digital technologies are not, as they have sometimes been considered by the leaderships, the private and public leaderships across Europe and beyond. Digitalization and digital technologies are not just something that is nice to have. Yeah, we can have them, but if there are other priorities, well, we will focus on the other priorities and digitalization will come afterward. As we are seeing very clearly, the investment, the infrastructure, the ability to use digital technologies all across societies, especially, but not only, but especially for industrialized advanced economies, has become, since some time now, absolutely essential. Not to put too fine a point on it, but without digital technologies, we could not be doing what we're doing right now. And the world, as much as I enjoy talking to you, the world will probably not stop if we could not have this seminar at distance. But as you're probably aware, and as I can assure you, there are plenty of essential interactions, transactions, activities that simply cannot function. It's not that they can function more or less well. They cannot function without appropriate digital technologies and policies and regulations to support the use of those digital technologies. And so why I'm saying this, it's because the strategic orientations, the goals, the main goals that the European Commission and more broadly the European Union wants to achieve by looking at digitalization is really based on the understanding of the essential necessity of these technologies. And what this means in practice is that, in our view, we need to make sure that certain preconditions all across Europe or across the European Union are fulfilled when it comes to digitalization. The first, quite obviously, is about infrastructure. Without high-speed broadband networks, without all across the territories, not only in the big cities, but also in rural areas, in hard-to-reach regions, for all people, not only for those who can afford it without too many problems, but also for social categories, for social groups, which have, let's not mince words, which have economic difficulties and might not always have all the money that is needed to access fast broadband. So fast broadband, efficient data centers, all of which has to be secure, has to be trustable, has to be designed in a way that protects our data, our personal data, but also commercial sensitive data. All of this has to be available to the largest segment of the population as possible. Now, to a large extent, this is a business of business, meaning there is, of course, a very strong role of the private sector to provide those services. But as I'm sure you're aware, the European Union is, and this is inscribed in the treaties of the European Union, is a social market economy. And what that means is that while on digitalization or any other area, we of course believe and we support a strong role for the private sector, but we do not believe that the private sector can or should fulfill every single need that society has. And so we have been, for a long time now, we have been supporting with public money, but also with the right regulatory environment, the deployment of broadband networks. And, you know, there are margins of improvement, but if you look at the numbers, we're actually faring not that bad in Europe, compare even with countries such as the US, where you have entire regions where broadband is simply not an option, or cheap broadband is simply not an option. Now, it makes no sense to have all the best infrastructure in the world if you do not know how to use it, if you do not have the means to use it, and if you don't have a regulatory environment that makes it easy to use it. Now, I could speak for hours about this, but let me just be very brief. This boils down to 2 or 3 important priorities on which, again, we are investing, not only the European Union, but the European Union plus the member states, and of course, with the involvement of all stakeholders. One important priority is skills, expertise, knowledge. The data that we have, which we collect mostly through Eurostat, which is the European Statistical Office, but also based on other research. We cooperate very closely on these matters with the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and also with the International Labour Organization and other entities. I have to confess that the data that we have in terms of the average skills of the European population, when it comes both to core ICT, ICT stands for Information and Communication Technologies, ICT skills, the broader segment of digital skills, but also all of those abilities and skills that are more and more necessary in a digitalized environment, such as media literacy, the ability to process information, more and more information that is coming our way. Well, the data is not super encouraging, I have to tell you. I'm an optimist, so I'm sure that we can improve, but that is clearly an area where urgent action is needed. Just to give you one number, according to our latest surveys and analysis, if I remember correctly, I might be off by a decimal point here and there, but about 40% of the European population does not even have basic digital skills, which in very concrete terms means that it is not able to do the most basic stuff on a computer. Now, it's clear that you have to look at these numbers and factor in demographics and age in it, because that number refers to a large extent to older people, to, again, not to mince words, but do not think for a second that the situation when it comes to younger generations is all rosy. We have significant challenges there as well, and this is a real issue for 2 reasons. One, because, well, 3 reasons, I would say. The first is that the wealth of any nation or of any group of nations like the European Union fundamentally lies in its people. That's what really makes a country or a group of countries wealthy. And if you do not equip those people with the tools that they need in order to succeed, it might not happen today, it might not happen tomorrow, but if you don't do that, you are on your way to obsolescence as a society. That's a reality that we have seen historically time and again, well before digitalization was on our plate. So that's the first reason. The second reason, and it's connected to the first, is that it takes time to develop the skills necessary all across the population. It takes time to develop the skills, to develop the education systems, to upgrade and update the formal and informal education systems that are necessary to get where we want to get. It is not something, it takes time and money and resources, but it is not something where you just snap your fingers and in 6 months you have a skilled population. The third reason was simply, and very briefly, that other parts of the world, other countries in the world are not just standing by, they're investing significant amounts of resources to upskill and reskill their population, whatever is the age. And although I don't believe that everything is competition in life, competition exists. We need to take that into account as well if we want Europe to remain competitive and continue to grow. And what I was saying is that I was actually wrong in saying that there are 3 reasons, there are 4 reasons. And the fourth one is connected to the first 3, and it's also very close to a dossier that I've been focusing on for the past few years, which is the transformation in the labor markets, in the workplaces, all kinds of workplaces that digitalization is producing. Simply put, the widespread deployment of digital technologies in all kinds of work means that a lot of ways in which people were working before is soon becoming obsolete. And unless we want to face a very grim reality of mass unemployment, which will be socially unacceptable, we need to make sure that workers, people who are already at work or people who are starting to enter the workplace, are equipped with the right skills and expertise to handle these digitalization trends. Now, by the way, Mireille, I would ask you to give me a sign when I'm about 5 minutes, 5 minutes before the 15 minutes mark, so I know when I have to start closing the presentation. So these are 2 very important directions, pillars of our work on digitalization. The second one is about a term that I used just before, which is about growth, economic growth. Now, to be clear, economic growth is not an end in and by itself. As I mentioned before, Europe is a social economy system, which means the social concerns, making sure that nobody is left behind, making sure that we have a well-functioning welfare system, public health system. These are all extremely important and, very important, that everything that we do is environmentally sustainable. All of this is very important. However, at the end of the day, if you want to have the resources, the financial resources to pay for all the measures that are needed in order to have all those other things, the social inclusion, environmental protection, all of that costs money. And in order to have that money, you need to have a vibrant and reasonably well-growing private sector. And therefore, we're also investing quite a bit of energies, thank you, Mireille. We're also investing quite a bit of energies and resources in making sure not so much to create the winners and the losers. That is not the job of public institutions in general, and certainly not the job of the European Commission. But our job and the job of public institutions in general is to create the framework, is to create the ecosystem, is to create the environment, which is mostly, but not only, the regulatory environment, which allows startups to be created, to scale, to become big companies, which also allow big companies to operate respectful of the law, of course, but to operate in a way that is conducive to the economic growth of every other player. This does not happen all by itself, and contrary to what some believe, the free market cannot solve everything, and this is not just a political position. We have very solid theoretical foundations to state that there are issues that the free market will not be able to solve. So you do need a certain regulatory environment, including in the digitalization space, which has its own challenges. It moves very quickly. Many subparts of the digital environments tend to very quick and high concentration, which therefore requires quite specific antitrust and anti-cartel measures. But the bottom line is that we ensuring that there is the opportunity for economic initiative for entrepreneurs to do what they know best, which is to innovate and to create new services and products. All of this in a manner that is respectful of our social and environmental objectives. Well, that is another priority in our digitalization strategy. And last but not least, and quite briefly, Europe is a social market economy. It is also a reality based on democratic values. And whether we look at the so-called offline or online environment, personally, I think that it has become almost impossible to distinguish between the two, if it ever was. But in any case, our democratic rules should apply, do apply, but certainly should apply both offline and online. And very often, we do not need new laws to do that or new rules. It is sufficient, it's difficult, but it is sufficient as a point of principle to apply and enforce the rules that we have in the online environment. But on the other hand, we also have specific challenges and issues which are linked to the online environment, which we need to address. And this includes matters such as cybersecurity. It includes matters such as propaganda measures, or as sometimes called fake news, which are not a specific and not a new phenomenon, but are multiplied are made more challenging by the ease with which digital technologies allow information to spread around. It is about the protection of our personal data and our privacy. All of these measures require the cooperation of everybody, but they also require quite clear rules, and they require, as we say in the field, teeth, enforcement teeth. And by way of example, well, by now it's a few years ago, but we're seeing now the first serious enforcement action. I can assure you that when you might be aware of that, when a few years ago, we upgraded our existing data protection, personal data protection legislation, which was based on a EU directive from 1995, and the European Union adopted the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which does not fundamentally change the basic principles of how in the European Union personal data is protected, but one big difference between the previous and the current legislation in the field of personal data protection is the enforcement, and is the extent of fines, financial penalties that can be applied to companies, to organizations, not only private sector companies, which do not abide by these rules, which can now get up to 4% of the global turnover of an organization, which for a large multinational is quite a lot of money. Well, I can assure you that once organizations, let's face it, in particular private sector organizations, saw that now the possibility for these real financial penalties existed, they really changed their tunes in terms of how seriously they took these rules. Now, we do not take on this or any other matter, and with this I would like to conclude, we do not look at the digital environment or as digitalization as as necessarily a confrontational environment, nor do we see our role as necessarily a punitive role, but rules are sometimes necessary, and we also need to have the means, all the means to enforce those rules. With this, I think I will stop here, Mireia, and hopefully there will be a lot of questions, hopefully easy questions, and I will be happy to address all the questions that might come up. Thank you very much.